Some scars don't bleed, they whisper. And for Jack Turner, a war-torn veteran barely holding his life together in the frozen streets of Kansas City, those whispers had followed him home from battle. The comrades he couldn't save, the daughter he never got to meet, the silence that filled every empty night. His only companion was Valor, a loyal German shepherd who had once dragged soldiers out of fire and now guided Jack through the wreckage of civilian life. But on one merciless winter night, Valor's sudden barking shattered that silence, leading Jack to an alley where a little girl lay trembling against a frozen wall, barefoot, lips blue, clutching an empty lunchbox like it was her only shield. And when Jack wrapped his coat around her tiny shoulders, her broken whisper cut deeper than any battlefield wound. "Please, don't lock me in the dark again." That moment changed everything. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a soul beaten into silence, a reflection of the ghosts Jack had carried for years. And as the storm raged outside, Jack would discover that sometimes the mission you were never assigned becomes the one that saves you. But who was this girl? And what darkness was she still trapped inside? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, hit subscribe, because the next chapter will break it wide open. The storm swept across Kansas City like a white tide devouring the night. The wind howled through narrow alleyways, rattling loose signs and scattering old newspapers like ghosts that refused to settle. Snow fell in heavy, relentless sheets, burying the familiar under a blanket of merciless cold. It was a night when no one with a home would dare step outside. And yet, Jack Turner had no choice. At 45, Jack walked with the deliberate, weary gait of a man who had lived too many lives inside one body. His frame was lean but hardened by years of military discipline, his broad shoulders slightly hunched beneath a threadbare green jacket that had seen better winters. A jagged scar traced the left side of his jaw, a remnant from a roadside explosion in Kandahar that had ended his last deployment and left him with PTSD that gnawed at the edges of his peace. His hair, once chestnut, was now flecked with gray, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his weathered face. There was a heaviness to his eyes, a pale, storm-washed blue that never seemed fully present, as if part of him had never made it home. Jack had been working a double shift at a small auto repair shop on the south side of the city, the kind of job that paid barely enough for rent and dog food, but kept his hands busy and his mind quieter. His only companion through it all was Valor, a 5-year-old German shepherd with thick black and tan fur, and a noble posture that hinted at the disciplined training of his past. Valor had once served as a military search and rescue dog, known for his uncanny ability to sense distress before humans could see it. Now, he served a different mission, keeping Jack tethered to life. The pair trudged side by side through the storm, Valor's powerful frame cutting through drifts of snow as his breath steamed into the frozen air. Jack shoved his calloused hands deeper into his pockets, his breath fogging beneath a knit cap pulled low over his brow. "Come on, boy," he muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Almost home." But home was a generous word. The apartment he rented above a laundromat on Maple Avenue was more of a refuge than a residence. Peeling wallpaper, a sputtering radiator, and a bed that creaked louder than his knees. Yet it was quiet. And quiet was a luxury for a man whose nights were still filled with the screams of the desert. They were halfway down an alley shortcut when Valor froze. His ears shot up, his muscles tensing beneath his winter-thick coat. A low, warning growl rumbled from his chest, followed by a sharp, insistent bark. Jack stopped too, his heartbeat stuttering. "What is it, boy?" Valor barked again and bolted into the darkness ahead. Jack cursed softly and followed, boots crunching through the snow. The alley was dimly lit by a flickering streetlight, its glow struggling against the curtain of falling snow. And then Jack saw it, or rather, her. Huddled against a brick wall mottled with frost was a little girl, no more than 6. She wore a torn red parka, the zipper stuck halfway, the thin fabric crusted with ice. Her bare feet were pressed into the slush, toes curled and mottled crimson from the cold. Long, dark hair clung damply to her cheeks, and her small face was pale, almost translucent beneath the streetlight. Her lips trembled, but she made no sound. In her arms, she clutched a cracked pink lunchbox decorated with a peeling unicorn sticker. She held it the way soldiers clutched their rifles, as if it were the only thing between her and the world. Jack's breath caught. For a moment, the snowstorm around them vanished, replaced by the ringing silence that followed an explosion, the kind that left only ghosts behind. His heart pounded harder than it had in years. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to her level. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice careful, steady, as if speaking too loud might break her. "Are you okay?" The girl flinched at the sound, her wide brown eyes darting to Valor, who sat a few feet away, his ears perked and his gaze gentle. She didn't answer. Jack waited, the snow piling silently on his shoulders. Finally, her lips parted. I can't go in without dinner." Jack blinked. "Go in where?" "Home," she whispered. Her voice was so small it almost disappeared into the wind. "Mama said, no dinner, no house." The words landed like a blow. Jack stared at the child, at the purple bruises blooming beneath the frayed cuffs of her sleeves, at the tiny fingers gripping the lunchbox so tight her knuckles had turned white. This wasn't just neglect. This was abandonment. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone gentle. "Sophie," she whispered. Jack swallowed hard. Sophie. The name sounded fragile in the frozen air. He glanced at Valor, who inched closer and pressed his nose gently against the girl's knee. Sophie didn't recoil. In fact, a faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips, the kind that slips out when a body too small has been too strong for too long. "You can't stay out here, Sophie," Jack said. "It's too cold." She shook her head quickly like a frightened animal. "I'm not allowed." Jack's chest tightened. He remembered nights in Afghanistan when he and his squad had huddled under broken walls, forbidden to move even as mortars fell around them. Obedience, he knew, could become a kind of prison. And here, in this snow-choked alley, a 6-year-old was already serving a sentence. Slowly he slipped off his heavy jacket and wrapped it around her small shoulders. She stiffened, bracing for something. A slap, a shove, but none came. Instead, the warmth seeped into her tiny frame, and she let out a breath so faint it nearly disappeared into the storm. "It's okay," Jack murmured. "You're safe now." A door slammed somewhere above them, echoing down the alley. Sophie's head snapped toward the sound, fear flashing raw and instinctive across her face. Jack's stomach twisted. He had seen that look before, in children caught in the crossfire, in refugees clutching at any scrap of safety they could find. He glanced up at the dark windows above. Somewhere in that building was a woman who had thrown this child into the snow. Somewhere up there was the reason Sophie trembled like a leaf in his coat. Jack's fists curled inside his pockets. He had promised himself, years ago, that he was done fighting. The wars were behind him. But standing there, watching this little girl clutch a broken lunchbox as if it were armor, he knew he was lying to himself. "Come on," he said finally, rising to his feet and extending a hand. "Let's get you out of the cold." Sophie hesitated, her wide eyes flicking from his hand to Valor, who wagged his tail slowly, patiently. After a long moment, she slipped her tiny hand into his. It was ice cold, feather light, but the trust it carried weighed more than any weapon Jack had ever held. They turned toward the mouth of the alley, the wind biting harder now, the storm thickening around them. Valor walked ahead, his sharp ears pricked, scanning the night for danger. Sophie stumbled once, and Jack caught her before she fell, steadying her against his side. "You're going to be okay," he whispered. "I promise." And as the three of them disappeared into the swirling snow, Jack knew this was only the beginning. He didn't know who Sophie's mother was, or why she had done this. He didn't know how deep the wounds ran, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not walk away. Not from this fight, not from her. The storm had not stopped by the time Jack reached his apartment. The icy wind followed them up the narrow staircase, and when the rusted door finally creaked open, the warmth inside felt like a fragile shield against the world outside. Jack's home was barely more than a single room, a small kitchenette with chipped counters, a sagging sofa that doubled as a bed, and a single heater groaning in the corner. But to a man who had slept in desert trenches and abandoned buildings, it was enough. For Sophie, it looked like another planet. She stood frozen in the doorway, clutching her pink lunchbox to her chest, as if it were armor. Her small body shivered, even though the heat had already begun to fill the room. Valor padded over to her and sat down gently at her feet, his tail thumping once against the floor, a silent invitation. The 5-year-old German shepherd's presence seemed to anchor the space, his intelligent amber eyes following Sophie's every movement with the patience of a seasoned guardian. "Come on in," Jack said softly, holding the door open. "It's not much, but it's warm." Sophie took a small step inside, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. She scanned the room quickly, the walls, the shadows, the single lamp casting its dim circle of light, as if searching for something unseen. Then, she retreated to the far corner and sat down with her knees pulled tight to her chest. Jack watched her from across the room. He had seen that look before, not on battlefields, but in the eyes of displaced children overseas. It was the look of someone who had learned that corners were safer than open spaces. "You hungry?" he asked, rummaging through the cabinet for a can of soup. Sophie didn't answer. She stared down at the unicorn sticker on her lunchbox, her small fingers tracing the edges again and again. Jack set the pot on the stove, the hiss of gas and the faint smell of tomatoes filling the air. He had nothing fancy, some soup, half a loaf of bread, and an apple he had meant to save for tomorrow's lunch. But watching the way Sophie's eyes followed the steaming pot, he knew tomorrow could wait. When the soup was ready, he poured it into a chipped bowl and placed it near her. "It's warm," he said gently. "You should eat." Sophie hesitated, glancing from the bowl to him. "I'm not allowed to eat before Mama." Jack's throat tightened. "You're safe here," he said slowly. "Mama isn't here. You can eat as much as you want." For a long moment, Sophie didn't move. Then, with cautious bird-like motions, she dipped the spoon into the soup. The first sip made her flinch, not because of the heat, but because she seemed to expect punishment for it. When none came, she ate again, and again. Soon the bowl was empty. Valor lay down beside her, resting his head on his paws, watching as she licked the last traces from the spoon. Then he nudged closer, curling his warm body against her legs. Sophie's shoulders, tense and high, began to drop. A small sigh slipped past her lips. It was the first sign of trust. Jack leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, his heart heavy. "Sophie," he said softly, "can you tell me what happened? Why were you outside?" She hugged her knees tighter. "Mama says I don't listen, that I make her sad, so I have to stay out until I fix it." "What does that mean?" "Fix it?" Jack asked carefully. Her voice was barely audible. "Bring food, or money, or stay until she says I can come in." The words stabbed deeper than he expected. Jack clenched his fists in his pockets, forcing himself to breathe. He wanted to storm into whatever apartment Sophie had come from and demand answers. But he knew better. Rage never solved anything. And right now, Sophie needed safety, not fury. The hours passed slowly. Sophie didn't speak again. She kept to the corner, her small body a shadow against the wall, flinching at every creak of the building. She refused to turn on the overhead light, insisting the dim lamp was enough. And when Jack offered the sofa, she chose to sleep curled on the floor beside Valor, her tiny hand resting on his fur. As night deepened, Jack sat awake by the window, his thoughts circling like the snowflakes outside. He had no idea what to do. Calling the police felt right, but it also meant Sophie might be returned to her mother. The system was broken. He had seen too many stories like this. Neglected children taken from danger, only to be sent back into it. And yet, doing nothing felt worse. The memory of Sophie's trembling voice, "I'm not allowed to eat before Mama," replayed in his mind like a cruel echo. He stared at the cracked plaster ceiling, wrestling with a choice that had no good outcome. Sometime after midnight, a soft sound pulled him from his thoughts. Sophie was awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor, a scrap of paper and a stub of crayon in her lap. Jack watched silently as she drew. Her small hand moved slowly, almost mechanically, dragging heavy black lines across the page. When she was done, she crossed the room and handed it to him without a word. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. A box with a lock, and above it, in shaky, uneven letters, one word: dark. Jack felt the air leave his lungs. "What is this?" he asked gently. Sophie stared at the floor. "That's where I go, when I'm bad." The room seemed to shrink around him. He could almost see it, a dark, airless space where a child was hidden away like an unwanted object, a place designed not to discipline, but to erase. Jack's jaw tightened as he folded the paper carefully. He slipped it into the drawer beside his bed, like evidence he already knew he would need. "Thank you for showing me," he said softly. "You're very brave, Sophie." She didn't respond, just climbed back down beside Valor and closed her eyes. Jack sat awake until dawn, staring at the paper again and again, his chest burning with a mix of sorrow and rage. The sun rose slowly over Kansas City, painting the snow in pale gold. Sophie stirred beneath the thin blanket, her eyes fluttering open. For a fleeting second, she looked peaceful, a child waking from an ordinary night. But then she saw the light streaming through the window and scrambled back into the shadowed corner. "Too bright," she whispered, trembling. "The dark is safer." Jack knelt beside her, his voice steady. "Not here. Here. Light is safe." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't move away either. Valor pressed his head gently against her knee, and she rested her small hand on his fur, grounding herself in his warmth. Jack looked out the window at the world beyond, the busy streets, the indifferent city, the hundreds of lives passing by without knowing a child had been left in the snow. He had spent years trying to disappear, convinced the world had no use for a broken soldier. But now, sitting in a tiny room with a frightened girl and a loyal dog, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. And he knew with unshakable certainty that this wasn't over. That drawing wasn't just a cry for help, it was a message, and Jack Turner was going to answer it. The winter morning arrived dull and gray, with snow still falling in slow, relentless flakes that blurred the city streets. Jack Turner hadn't slept. The faint glow of dawn leaked through the thin curtains of his apartment, but he sat hunched on the edge of the bed, watching Sophie breathe softly on the floor where she had curled beside Valor. The little girl clutched the cracked pink lunchbox even in her sleep, as if letting go of it would erase the last thread of control she had left. Jack rubbed a hand over his tired face. The drawing of the locked box, dark scrawled above it in trembling letters, lay folded on the table beside him. It was evidence, but not enough. He knew that. If he was going to save Sophie, he needed more than a sketch. He needed proof the system could not ignore. When she woke, Sophie said nothing. She ate the toast he made in silence, eyes fixed on the floor. The bruises on her wrists were darker now, no longer hidden by the frayed sleeves of her sweater. Jack's chest burned. Enough was enough. "Put your shoes on, kid," he said gently. "We're going out." Her small face tightened with worry. "Where?" "To make sure you're okay," Jack replied. "I promise. I'll be with you the whole time." An hour later, they stepped into the cold. Valor trotted faithfully at Jack's side, his thick fur dusted with snowflakes. Sophie clung to Jack's coat sleeve as they walked the 6 blocks to Mercy Children's Hospital, a modest red brick building known more for its overworked staff than its resources. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee. A receptionist, a short, middle-aged woman with streaked blonde hair and tired eyes, led them to an exam room without many questions. Within minutes, the door opened and Dr. Renee Marshall walked in. Dr. Marshall was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with a composed presence that came from decades of treating broken bodies and broken homes. Her light brown hair was tied neatly back, and her gray eyes, sharp and observant, softened as soon as they landed on Sophie. "Hello, sweetheart," she said gently, crouching to meet the girl's gaze. "I'm Renee. Can I take a look at you?" Sophie hesitated but nodded. Valor remained close, sitting at the foot of the exam table like a sentry. Renee worked slowly and carefully, examining Sophie's arms, her legs, the bruises on her ribs. "These marks," she murmured, her brows furrowing. "Some of them are fresh. Others have been here for weeks, maybe months." Jack's jaw clenched. "She told me her mother locks her in a closet, leaves her outside in the cold." Renee sighed. "I've seen this before. It's not just neglect. It's long-term abuse." She stepped aside and picked up a phone. "We need to file a report with Child Protective Services." Within an hour, a social worker arrived. Luis Ortega was a man in his mid-30s, with close-cropped black hair, warm brown skin, and a tired yet determined expression. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his tie loosened, and he carried a well-worn leather folder under one arm. "Mr. Turner," he said, shaking Jack's hand. "I'm Luis. I'll be handling Sophie's case." Luis crouched beside Sophie, his voice calm and steady. "I want you to know you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. but I need to ask a few questions. Is that okay?" Sophie nodded, though she barely whispered her answers. Yes, she was left outside if she didn't bring home food. Yes, her mother sometimes locked her in a small space. Yes, she had been hit before. With every word, Jack's heart twisted tighter. Louise stood and turned to Jack. "We're documenting everything. With Dr. Marshall's report and what Sophie's told us, we have a strong case, but—" He paused, glancing down at his notes. "You need to understand that her mother still has legal custody. Until a court orders otherwise, she has rights." As if summoned by those words, the door swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Evelyn Hart stepped inside. She was in her mid-30s but looked older, her face lined not by time but by bitterness. Her dark auburn hair was hastily tied back, her lipstick smudged, and her once pretty features were hardened by anger and sleepless nights. A heavy coat hung from her thin frame, and a cigarette's stale scent clung to her like a second skin. Her eyes, cold and sharp as broken glass, locked onto Sophie. "There you are," she hissed. "I've been looking everywhere." Sophie recoiled, shrinking back against Jack. Valor rose instantly, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Evelyn's gaze snapped to the dog. "Get that animal away from my daughter." "She's not safe with you," Jack said evenly, stepping between them. "Not after what you've done." "Done?" Evelyn's laugh was brittle. "I'm her mother. You're nothing. You kidnapped her." Luis moved quickly, placing himself between Evelyn and Sophie. "Miss Hart, please lower your voice. We're conducting an official investigation." "I don't care about your investigation," Evelyn spat. "She's coming home with me." Valor barked sharply, the sound echoing off the sterile walls. Evelyn flinched and stumbled back. Sophie's small hand clutched Jack's sleeve. "Please," she whispered, "don't make me go." Jack's fists curled, but Luis placed a firm hand on his arm. "There's nothing we can do right now," he said quietly. "Legally, she's still the guardian." Jack stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious. Look at her. Look at what she's done." "I know," Luis said, his face tight with frustration. "But without a court order, we have no authority to keep Sophie here." Evelyn stepped forward, her lips twisting into a cold smile. "Come on, Sophie. Let's go." The little girl's knees trembled as she slid off the exam table. Valor positioned himself in front of her, his teeth bared in silent warning. Evelyn froze, fear flashing briefly across her face. "Call off your dog," she snapped. "Valor," Jack said softly. The German shepherd's growl faded, but he didn't move. His amber eyes stayed fixed on Evelyn, a living barrier between her and the child. Sophie's steps toward the door were hesitant, each one heavier than the last. At the threshold, she looked back, not at Evelyn, but at Jack. Her eyes, wide and glistening, were filled with a silent plea. Jack felt something inside him break. He had seen innocent people suffer before, but never like this. Never so close, never so helpless. And as Evelyn led Sophie away, his heart screamed against the injustice. Luis placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll do everything I can," he said quietly. "This isn't over, but it's going to take time." Jack stared at the empty hallway where Sophie had vanished. Valor pressed against his leg, whining softly as if to echo his thoughts. "Time," Jack muttered bitterly. "She doesn't have time." The snow outside had stopped, but the world felt colder than ever. And as Jack walked out of the hospital, Valor pacing silently beside him, he made a vow. A soldier's vow, born from the part of him that refused to surrender. He would not let Sophie disappear back into the dark. Not now. Not ever. The snow had melted into a dirty slush by the time Jack found himself once again on Maple Street, staring at the decaying apartment block where Evelyn Hart lived. It was a bleak structure of gray concrete and flickering hallway lights, the kind of place that seemed to breathe misery through its cracked windows. Jack leaned against a rusted lamppost across the street, collar turned up, cap pulled low, his breath fogging the frigid night air. Valor sat quietly beside him, ears twitching, amber eyes fixed on the building's entrance. Neither of them had moved for almost 2 hours. It had been 3 days since Sophie was taken from the hospital and forced back into Evelyn's custody. 3 days of silence. 3 days of gnawing doubt that kept Jack awake through the long nights. He couldn't shake the image of her small hand slipping from his at the hospital door, or the look in her eyes, a silent plea carved into his memory. He had promised himself, then and there, that he wouldn't stop until she was safe, and tonight that promise had brought him here. Luis Ortega had been hesitant when Jack first suggested surveillance. The social worker was a man bound by the limitations of his profession, always balancing compassion with the weight of the law. But after reviewing Sophie's medical report again and rereading her testimony, he had agreed to help, off the record. Luis joined him shortly after midnight. He was dressed plainly, a dark overcoat thrown over his shirt and tie, his breath clouding in the cold. "This is dangerous," he muttered, adjusting his wire rim glasses nervously. "If we get caught, I lose my job." "If we don't do this," Jack replied quietly, "a 6-year-old girl might not survive the winter." The two men stood in silence for a while, watching the apartment windows. The lights inside were mostly dark now, except for one dim glow on the second floor. Valor shifted suddenly, his ears perking and his nose tilting toward the wind. Then, a soft sound, so faint Jack almost missed it, drifted from the building. A whimper. Not the sound of a child crying loudly for help, but the muffled sobs of someone who had learned that crying only made things worse. Jack's heart lurched. "You hear that?" Luis nodded grimly. "We need to go in. Tonight." They waited until nearly 2 a.m., when Evelyn finally stumbled out of the building. Even from across the street, Jack could see she was disheveled. A heavy coat thrown hastily over pajamas, a cigarette glowing between her fingers as she climbed into a beat-up sedan and drove off. "Probably another night shift," Luis muttered. "She works at a bar downtown, won't be back for hours." Jack checked the alley behind the building, where a rusted fire escape clung precariously to the brick wall. "This is our chance." Valor followed silently as they climbed the creaking metal stairs. Jack's knees protested, but adrenaline kept him moving. The second-floor window was locked, but Luis produced a small tool from his pocket, one of the few perks of his years working child protection in rough neighborhoods. Within seconds, the latch clicked and the window slid open. The apartment smelled of stale smoke and damp carpet. It was dark except for a faint light spilling from the living room, where an old television buzzed with static. The walls were stained, the furniture mismatched and filthy. But it wasn't the disarray that made Jack's stomach twist. It was the silence. "Check every room," he whispered. They moved cautiously through the apartment. The bedroom was empty. The kitchen was cold and bare, with dirty dishes piled in the sink and empty liquor bottles lined along the counter. But it was Valor who found it, his nose pressed to a section of wall near the hallway closet. He growled softly, pawing at the baseboard. Jack knelt beside him. The door was small, barely 4 feet high, with a cheap padlock dangling loosely from the latch. When he tugged, it opened with a creak. What lay beyond made Luis swear under his breath. The space was no bigger than a storage cabinet, its walls scratched and stained. A single torn blanket was crumpled in one corner. The floor was filthy, sticky with old spills and littered with crumbs and scraps of paper. And on the back wall, faint but visible in the dim light, were tiny marks etched into the plaster. Days, weeks, tally marks, countless of them. "Oh God," Luis whispered. "She's been keeping her in here." Jack didn't speak. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers over the marks. He could picture it. Sophie curled up here, knees to her chest, counting the days in the dark. He reached into the space, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. It was a strip of broken tape with residue where an old lock had once been reinforced. "This isn't discipline," Jack said, his voice shaking with restrained fury. "This is torture." Luis nodded, his face pale. "This is enough for a criminal case, but we need Sophie's testimony to tie it together. Without her..." Jack's jaw tightened. "We'll get it." They documented everything they could. Photographs of the closet, the tally marks, the filthy floor. Valor sniffed around the space, then let out a low, mournful whine, as if sensing the fear that had soaked into the walls. They left the apartment quietly, locking the window behind them. 2 days later, during a supervised visitation at the Child Services office, Jack saw Sophie again. It was a brief meeting. 10 minutes, strictly monitored, but it was enough. She looked thinner than before, her cheeks hollow, her lips dry. The light in her eyes had dimmed, as if someone had snuffed it out. She sat silently across from him at the small metal table, Valor lying obediently at his feet. "Hi, kid," Jack said softly. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice monotone. But then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She slid it across the table. It was another drawing. This one showed a figure, small, faceless, standing outside a house under a dark sky. Beside it were the words written in shaky block letters, "If I don't bring food, I don't deserve the light." Jack's throat constricted. "Sophie? Who told you that?" She didn't answer, but her eyes told him everything. Luis, standing near the door, watched the exchange with a grim expression. "This is enough," he said quietly when the visit ended. "We have the closet, we have the drawings, we're getting close." "Close isn't good enough," Jack muttered. "We need her out of there, now." Valor pressed against his leg, sensing the turmoil building inside him. Jack placed a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself. "We're not done," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Not even close." As he walked out into the cold night, the city's lights flickering dimly through the falling snow, Jack knew the road ahead would be long. But now, for the first time, he had something real. Proof that the darkness behind Evelyn Hart's door was more than just metaphor. And he swore, with the resolve of a soldier who had survived war, that he would bring that darkness into the light. The sky over Kansas City wore the dull gray of late winter, heavy with snow that refused to fall. The streets were slick and silent, the air carrying the sharp scent of exhaust and ice. Jack Turner trudged home from another grueling shift at the mechanic's shop, his boots leaving wet imprints on the cracked sidewalk. Valor padded beside him, the German shepherd's thick black and tan coat dusted with flecks of frost, his sharp amber eyes constantly scanning the world ahead. Jack had learned to trust those eyes more than his own. The dog sensed things, danger, sadness, fear, long before Jack ever could. It had been a week since they had broken into Evelyn's apartment and uncovered the dark closet. A week since Sophie's haunting drawing had confirmed their worst fears. But still, the legal system moved at a crawl, and the little girl remained in the hands of the very person who had hurt her. The weight of that knowledge gnawed at Jack's conscience, like shrapnel buried under scar tissue. "Come on, Valor," he muttered, shoving his hands deeper into his coat pockets. "Let's go home." But Valor didn't follow. Instead, he stopped at the mouth of a narrow alley, the same alley where weeks ago they had found Sophie trembling in the snow. The dog's ears perked, his nose twitching as he stepped forward, tail stiff and alert. Jack sighed. "What is it, boy?" Valor barked once, sharp and insistent, then trotted deeper into the alley. Jack followed, boots crunching over patches of ice. The alley was empty now, just brick walls streaked with grime and a rusted dumpster sagging beneath the weight of fresh snow. But Valor stopped halfway down, staring up at a corner of the building. Jack followed his gaze and saw it. A security camera, small and weather-beaten, bolted above a second-story window. "Good eyes," Jack murmured, his pulse quickening. The camera looked ancient, maybe forgotten, but if it was still functional, it might have captured something. Anything that could help them. He knocked on the building's side door until a middle-aged man answered. The man was stocky and balding, with grease-stained overalls and the wary eyes of someone who'd lived too long in a bad neighborhood. "Yeah?" he grunted. "Sorry to bother you," Jack said, trying to sound casual. "I noticed that old camera on your wall. Do you know if it still works?" The man glanced up at the camera and shrugged. "Might. Belonged to my brother before he passed. It's hooked to an old DVR in the back, but I haven't checked it in years." Jack hesitated before speaking again. "I'm trying to help a little girl who was hurt right here. If there's any footage, it could mean saving her life." Something softened in the man's eyes. He scratched his chin, then nodded. "All right, come on in." The interior of the building was cramped and cluttered, a mix of old furniture, tools, and dust-covered electronics. They found the DVR buried beneath a pile of cardboard boxes. Miraculously, it still worked. For hours, Jack and the man sifted through grainy footage, rewinding and fast-forwarding through weeks of static and motion-triggered clips. And then, there it was. The timestamp showed the night Jack had first found Sophie. The camera caught her small figure pressed against the wall, barefoot, shivering violently in the snow. She never moved. Not for minutes, not for hours. At one point, the door above opened, and Evelyn's thin silhouette peered down, cigarette smoke curling into the night. She looked at Sophie, muttered something, then slammed the door shut again. Jack's jaw tightened. They had her. Real evidence. The next day he took the footage, along with Sophie's drawings, the photographs of the closet, and her medical records, to meet with a lawyer. Amelia Brooks was not the kind of attorney Jack had expected. She was young, maybe 30, with chestnut brown hair cut into a sharp bob and intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing. She dressed simply, a navy blazer and dark jeans, but carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought difficult battles before. Amelia had grown up in a low-income neighborhood herself, she told him, and had once been a foster child. That history had shaped her into a relentless advocate for children. "I read the case file you sent over," she said, flipping through the evidence spread across her small office table. "It's horrifying, but it's also strong. We can work with this." "You think we have a chance?" Jack asked, unable to hide the doubt in his voice. Amelia looked up, meeting his eyes. "I don't just think. I know. With this footage, we can petition for an emergency custody hearing. We'll argue that Sophie is in immediate danger and should be removed from Evelyn's care while the investigation continues." She tapped a finger against the grainy still of Evelyn peering out the door. "Courts don't like hearsay, but this," she slid the photo across the table, "this is not hearsay. This is proof." For the first time in weeks, Jack felt something stir inside him. Hope. Over the next several days, Amelia filed the necessary paperwork, and Jack worked closely with Luis to build the strongest possible case. Every piece of evidence, the medical reports, the closet photographs, Sophie's own words, was compiled into a single powerful dossier. They even secured a statement from the neighbor who had once seen Sophie left outside. Through it all, Valor never left Jack's side. The German Shepherd's presence had always been steady, but now it was something more. When Sophie was allowed supervised visits, Valor was the only one she approached without fear. She would sit beside him silently, her small hands buried in his thick fur, her breathing slowing to match the dog's calm rhythm. Sometimes she fell asleep against his side, and Valor wouldn't move for hours, not even when his legs cramped. One afternoon during a visit, Sophie pressed her face into Valor's neck and whispered so quietly Jack almost missed it. "He's the only one who never leaves." Jack swallowed hard. "He's here to protect you," he said gently, "and so am I." The petition hearing was scheduled for the following week. Amelia prepared Jack for what to expect. Evelyn's lawyers would fight hard, paint him as a meddler, accuse him of overstepping. But this time, they would walk into court with more than just stories. They would walk in with evidence. On the eve of the hearing, Jack stood by the window of his small apartment, watching snow swirl beneath the dim orange glow of the street lamps. Valor lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, but his ears twitched at every sound outside. Jack reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You found her," he whispered, "and you're going to help me save her." Valor thumped his tail once against the floor, as if he understood. For the first time since the night they had met Sophie, Jack allowed himself to believe that they might actually win. The system was slow, cruelly indifferent at times, but he wasn't alone anymore. With Amelia's determination, Luis's persistence, Sophie's courage, and Valor's unwavering instinct, they were building a case that could pierce even the darkest shadows. And as the snow fell heavier outside, blanketing the city in silence, Jack whispered a promise into the night. "We're coming for you, Sophie. And this time, we're not leaving without you." The courthouse of Jackson County rose like an old cathedral against the pale gray Kansas City sky, its weathered limestone facade streaked with snowmelt and soot. Jack Turner stood on the cold steps beneath its stone pillars, tugging nervously at the cuffs of his threadbare jacket. The air smelled of wet concrete and exhaust, and his heart thudded in a slow, heavy rhythm that echoed louder than the city's morning traffic. Beside him, Valor sat motionless, ears erect, amber eyes scanning every passerby with the same calm vigilance he had once shown on war-torn streets overseas. Jack reached down to scratch the dog's neck, grounding himself. "You ready, boy?" he murmured. Valor huffed softly, a sound that wasn't quite a bark, but enough to steady Jack's shaking hands. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with restrained chaos. Reporters gathered near the corridor entrance, their breath clouding the air as they whispered over notepads. Lawyers hurried by with folders clutched tightly, their polished shoes echoing off the marble floor. Jack felt out of place, a man in a frayed jacket and scuffed boots, worlds away from the suits and silk ties swirling around him. But this wasn't about appearances. This was about Sophie. Amelia Brooks walked up beside him, her dark blazer immaculate, a stack of files pressed to her chest. The young lawyer looked focused but calm, her hazel eyes betraying the steely resolve beneath her. "Remember," she said quietly, "they're going to try to discredit everything. Stay calm, speak only when asked, and trust me to do the rest." Jack nodded, exhaling slowly. "I trust you." The courtroom was smaller than he'd imagined, but it carried the weight of judgment in every detail. The oak benches, the high-backed judge's chair, the rows of silent spectators. Judge Caroline Whitaker presided, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a bun and a gaze that could pierce through excuses. Years of presiding over difficult custody battles had given her a reputation for being both fair and uncompromising. On the opposite side of the room, Evelyn Hart sat stiffly, her sharp features painted into an expression of righteous indignation. Her blonde hair was styled into a severe knot, and she wore a dark navy dress that screamed respectability. But her eyes, cold, darting, restless, betrayed the bitterness beneath the surface. Next to her stood her attorney, Howard Callahan, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a square jaw, deep frown lines, and a voice honed by years of courtroom theatrics. Callahan was notorious for his ruthless tactics and his ability to twist narratives to suit his clients. "Your Honor," Callahan began, stepping to the center of the courtroom, "this case is nothing more than a gross misrepresentation of a devoted mother by a man with no relation to the child and no legal standing. My client has been vilified by a stranger who took it upon himself to kidnap her daughter, fabricate wild stories of abuse, and manipulate public sympathy to his advantage." Jack's fists tightened at the word kidnap, but Amelia placed a hand on his arm, a silent reminder to stay composed. Callahan gestured toward Jack. "Mr. Turner is not a relative, not a guardian, and certainly not a hero. He is a troubled veteran with no means to support a child, no stable income, and a history of psychological instability. He wants to save this girl to fill a void in his own life, not because she needs saving." Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Amelia rose smoothly, her voice measured but sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. None of this is evidence. It's character assassination." "Overruled," Judge Whitaker said coolly. "Proceed, Mr. Callahan, but tread carefully." The defense called their first witness, a middle-aged woman named Deborah Lanning, a neighbor of Evelyn's. Deborah was short and thin, with neatly curled gray hair and a pearl necklace that shook slightly as she spoke. She claimed she had once seen Jack lurking near Evelyn's apartment at night and alleged that he had taken Sophie without permission. But Amelia was ready. "Mrs. Lanning," she asked during cross-examination, "do you recall the date you claimed to have seen my client take Sophie?" Deborah hesitated. "I believe it was the 10th. Amelia smiled thinly. "On the 10th, Mr. Turner was in New York City speaking at a veterans outreach event. Here are the flight logs, hotel records, and video from the event. Are you sure about the date?" Deborah faltered. I must be mistaken." The courtroom stirred, and Callahan quickly called another witness, a middle-aged man named Frank Darden, who testified that Sophie often seemed happy and well-fed. But Amelia produced Sophie's medical records documenting months of malnutrition, bruising, and frostbite scars. Frank's testimony crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Then came the turning point. Amelia approached the bench with a USB drive. "Your Honor, the plaintiff would like to submit new evidence." The courtroom screen flickered to life. The grainy footage from the alley played silently for all to see. Sophie barefoot in the snow, shivering uncontrollably as Evelyn's silhouette appeared in the doorway above, glancing out before shutting the door again. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Evelyn's face blanched, her lips tightening as the image replayed on a loop. "This," Amelia said quietly, "is not a fantasy. It is not exaggeration. It is a 6-year-old child forced to endure sub-zero temperatures as punishment, and it is only one piece of a much larger pattern." Then she presented Sophie's drawings, the crayon sketches of locked boxes in darkness, the word dark scrawled over and over again in shaky handwriting. And finally the courtroom fell utterly silent as Sophie herself was called to the stand. She was tiny, smaller than anyone had realized, wearing a simple pale blue dress and holding the same cracked pink lunchbox she had clutched the night Jack found her. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a loose braid, and her cheeks were flushed from nerves. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom said, if I don't bring food home, I have to stand in the dark." The gallery froze. Even Judge Whitaker's normally impassive expression softened. Amelia knelt beside her. "And where do you have to stand, Sophie?" "In the closet," the girl murmured, eyes downcast. "Sometimes all night." Callahan rose quickly, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, this child has been coached. She's repeating what this man wants her to say." But the judge raised a hand. "Mr. Callahan, I think we've heard enough." Evelyn stood suddenly, fury blazing in her eyes. "She's lying. All of this, it's lies. She's the reason my son died. She's the reason my husband left. Every misery in my life is because of her." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Jack stared at Evelyn, stunned by the venom in her words. Sophie shrank in her seat, clutching her lunchbox tighter, as if trying to make herself disappear. Judge Whitaker banged her gavel for silence. "Order! Order!" When the noise finally died, her voice was grave. "This court has heard compelling evidence on both sides. However, before a final decision can be rendered, further investigation is required. The hearing will be adjourned and reconvened once Child Protective Services completes their review." A hush fell over the room. Evelyn sat back down, panting with rage. Jack felt the floor tilt beneath him. After everything, there would be no resolution today. Amelia placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "We did what we could," she whispered. "Now we wait." As the courtroom emptied, Valor pressed against Jack's leg, his warmth grounding him amid the chaos. Jack looked down at Sophie, who had been led back to her guardian's bench. She glanced up at him briefly, her wide eyes shimmering with unspoken fear, but also, perhaps, a flicker of hope. "Hang on, kid," Jack murmured under his breath. "We're not done yet." Kansas City awoke under the first hesitant blush of spring, but for Jack Turner, the days felt colder than any winter night he had ever known. The courtroom had gone quiet for weeks, and yet the silence had teeth, gnawing at his patience, scraping at the thin edges of his hope. Each sunrise brought another day of waiting for the final hearing, another day wondering if Sophie would be safe long enough to make it there. Valor sensed his unease. The German shepherd, now 6 years old, his black and tan coat thickening with the changing season, stayed glued to Jack's side, his ears always pricked, his eyes scanning every alley they passed on their walks. For Jack, those walks were the only thing that kept his mind from unraveling. But one afternoon, just as the sky began to bruise into twilight, everything changed. Jack was at home, mending a broken kitchen chair, when his phone rang. It was Luis Ortega, the CPS officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with graying hair and the weary posture of someone who had seen too many children slip through the cracks. His voice was tight. "Jack, Sophie's gone." The world seemed to tilt. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "Her mother reported her missing 2 hours ago. We think she ran away." Jack's stomach dropped. "She's just a kid. She could be anywhere." "She's resourceful," Luis said, "but she's terrified. And terrified kids don't get far." Jack grabbed his coat and whistled for Valor. "Then we're finding her before she's lost for good." They started where it had all begun, the alley behind Lambert's Market. Valor sniffed the ground, pacing in tight circles, then darted toward a narrow street Jack didn't recognize. They followed him past rows of boarded-up storefronts and shuttered warehouses, until he stopped abruptly, nose pressed to the air, ears twitching. He barked once and bolted toward an abandoned storage facility at the edge of the rail yard. The building was skeletal, its brick walls crumbling, its windows broken, its metal door rusted with age. But Valor's instincts were rarely wrong. Jack pushed the door open, and the smell of dust and oil rushed out. "Sophie?" he called into the dark. His voice echoed back to him, thin and hollow. They moved deeper inside, flashlights cutting through the gloom. Then, from behind a stack of rotting crates, came a sound, a soft, stifled sob. Valor bounded forward, his nails clicking against the concrete. There, curled into a trembling ball beneath a tattered tarp, was Sophie. Her small frame was thinner than ever, her face pale beneath a layer of grime. The pink lunchbox, now scratched and dented, was clutched tightly to her chest. Her blonde hair hung in tangles, and her bare feet were streaked with dirt and blood. When she looked up, her eyes were wide with fear, like a cornered animal. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "Don't take me back. She'll put me in the dark again." Jack's throat tightened. He crouched beside her slowly, careful not to startle her. "I'm not here to take you back," he said softly. "I'm here to take you home." Valor lay down beside Sophie, pressing his warm body against her cold legs. The dog's tail thumped gently, his amber eyes watching her with wordless understanding. Sophie's trembling eased as she buried her face in his fur, her small fingers gripping his collar. Moments later, the sound of footsteps echoed through the building. Luis, accompanied by Officer Rachel Monroe, a seasoned police officer with dark hair streaked with silver and a reputation for unflinching compassion. Rachel knelt beside Sophie and spoke gently, her Midwestern accent softening the edges of every word. "You're safe now, sweetheart. No one's going to hurt you anymore." The discovery of Sophie hiding from her mother became the final piece of evidence the case desperately needed. Her fear wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was real, undeniable, and documented. Within hours, the story reached the judge's chambers, and the final hearing was moved up. 3 days later, the courthouse was packed once again. Judge Caroline Whitaker presided with her usual poise, but even her sharp gaze softened as she read the new reports. The room was heavy with tension. Evelyn sat rigid in her seat, her hair disheveled, her lips pressed into a thin line. The arrogance she once carried had curdled into desperation. Amelia Brooks rose, composed as ever. "Your Honor, the evidence now speaks louder than any testimony. Sophie's attempt to flee her home, despite the risks, proves what we've argued all along. She is living in fear, in an environment that endangers her physical and emotional well-being." Callahan, Evelyn's attorney, tried one last defense. "Children run away all the time. It's hardly—" "Children run away from danger," Amelia cut in sharply. "Not from safety." The gallery murmured. The judge raised her hand. "Order!" Then she spoke, her voice resonant and deliberate. "This court finds clear and compelling evidence of abuse, neglect, and endangerment. Effective immediately, Evelyn Hart is stripped of all parental rights and is remanded into custody to face charges of felony child abuse." Evelyn shot to her feet, fury twisting her features. "You can't do this! She's my daughter!" "She was your responsibility," the judge replied coldly, "and you failed her." 2 deputies stepped forward, cuffing Evelyn's wrists as she screamed obscenities. The sound echoed down the hallway long after she was led away. When the courtroom fell silent again, Judge Whitaker turned to Jack. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice softening, "though your means are modest, the court recognizes the unwavering care, protection, and love you have shown Sophie. It is this court's judgment that you be granted full legal guardianship." For a moment, Jack couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sophie, seated next to Amelia, turned to him with tears glistening in her eyes. "Does that mean I can stay?" Jack knelt beside her, his hands shaking. "It means you're coming home." Months later, Kansas City blossomed into spring. The streets once buried under snow were now lined with budding trees and bright storefronts. Jack's small apartment, once empty and silent, was filled with laughter and the soft patter of small footsteps. Sophie had her own room now, walls painted sky blue, shelves lined with books and stuffed animals. And on the refrigerator door, taped proudly for all to see, was her latest drawing. The Door to the Stars, a swirl of colors depicting a little girl and a man standing beneath a sky full of light, with a dog watching over them. Every evening they walked together through the neighborhood, Jack in his worn boots, Valor trotting beside him, and Sophie skipping just ahead, her pink lunchbox now filled not with emptiness, but with snacks and crayons. Sometimes she would stop, tug his sleeve, and point at the sunset. "Look, Jack," she'd say, her voice full of wonder. "It's like the stars are coming to meet us." And every time Jack would smile, his heart fuller than it had been in decades. "They already have, kid," he'd whisper. "They already have." Sometimes, God's miracles don't arrive with thunder or angels. Sometimes, they come on 4 legs with a wagging tail, or in the form of a broken man who refuses to walk away. Sophie's story is proof that even in the darkest corners of our world, light is always searching for a way in. And when that light finds a heart willing to protect, to love, and to stand firm against cruelty, it can change not just one life, but two. Jack Turner never planned to be a savior. He was just a weary soul trying to survive his own battles. But God often works through ordinary people, through the hands that reach out, the arms that hold, and the love that refuses to give up. Valor was more than a dog. He was a vessel of divine purpose, a living reminder that faith isn't just about believing. It's about acting when it matters most. And maybe that's the message for all of us. Every day, there are Sophies around us, silent, scared, waiting for someone to see them. We might not be rich, powerful, or perfect, but if we let God's compassion guide us, we can become someone's miracle. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that love can heal. Comment Amen below to join us in praying for every child still waiting for safety. And subscribe to follow more stories where faith, kindness, and courage change the impossible into hope. May God bless you and your family, and may you always have the strength to be the light in someone else's darkness.